Hi, Paul from Paul's Custom Targets. Well, you can tell. Today I want to talk about a problem that most shooters, especially in field target, experience each time we go to a match. Now, I belong to the Tar Heel Air Gun Club. It's located here in North Carolina, and I'm at 45-foot elevation above sea level, and I go to 1,000, 1,900. It's like 15 to 1,800 down in Puerto Rico. So altitude always affects you a little bit, but one that really affects you the most is the temperature shift on your scope. Now, temperature shift on a scope, it's never really been fully explained, okay? At least I haven't found it. But a way to compensate for that is something that I came up with after I had an experience at our club. We had a winter match where we started at 28 degrees. That's Fahrenheit. And what happened was we started off, I was in about lane 13, and I started shooting, and everything close I was knocking down, but everything that was far away, past 45 yards to 50 in that range, I would miss them. And by the third lane, I realized it was hitting low. So just for giggles, I dialed it up 10. Boom. Right from then on, every time I was past 35 to 45 yards, if I twisted my knobs up there and took 10 more, add 10 more to my clicks, I would drop the far target. Then the issue was we came all the way back down to lane 1, which is down deep in the woods. This is an all woods course. Up at the upper course, there was some sun coming through across a field. Well, we get down there, and I felt the cold. Well, I started shooting on lane 1, and I went to lane 8. Never dropped the target. Now, I was hitting the faceplates, but I couldn't drop the target. I tried compensating up and down. I even tried starting to use mill holds. Nothing worked. 8 lanes, I didn't drop a target. Okay, that's a total of 32 targets. I gave up. So I did a DNF. I did not finish, and I stayed and scored from my partner that was there with me at that time. Okay, now the problem is we have to use scope parallax in order to range how far the target is out and away. So on our scopes, we label all the distances, okay? And at your home range, all you need to do, let's see if I get that back up. At your home range, all you need to do is set individual targets out every 1 yard, and then start shooting. And when you look at it, you click to whatever it is, or I have an Eric Sanders program from Scope Knob that does it for me. I just have to shoot 10 and 55 and put the figures in. But for mill holds, usually you have to go shoot the target, figure out the mill hold, write that down on a piece of paper, and make a card. Okay, well, the problem is each scope has a different shift. Some shift at different temperatures compared to the other. Again, there's no real explanation anywhere I could find on why it does that. So anyway, I decided I was going to come home and I forgot. I also, when we came out of the woods, our president at the time had his crony there, and I cronied, and my speed on the gun, this is a Steyr LG-110 at that time, and my speed was perfect. So I couldn't figure out what was going crazy. Well, I came home the next day and I started again, this time at 18 degrees, and I started shooting my distances. And as I shot my distances, I noticed that I was reading on my side scope, it might have read 30 yards, but I was hitting too high or too low, and I couldn't explain it. So I started doubling those clicks back, or doubling them up, and then figured out where it was going, and it drove me crazy. So what I did to compensate finally is I came up with a little, what I call a cold chart. Okay, the cold chart was a real simple thing to make. I had to start at 28 degrees basically, and then I went out and it was, let's see here, from 28 to 30. So from 28 to 30 degrees, I kept firing at my ranges and figuring out how far off they were and how many clicks I need to add. By the time I got done, I ended up with this click chart. Now with the click chart, it's pretty simple. All it is 3 columns. The first column is what my scope is telling me that distance is to that target once it comes in focus. The second target is where I use a laser thermometer and I check my scope. If I see I'm in this 28 to 30 degrees and it's reading 30 yards, it is actually 28 yards. And at that point there, I have to turn my knobs, I click it to the 30-yard mark, and then I got to add 30 yards, I got to add 12 more. So at 30 yards, I click to my, what 30 is supposed to be, and then I count up 12 more clicks. Puts me dead on. And I did that for the 28 to 30. And then I went and did it from 30 to 35, which after 35 I started getting different readings. Then I went 40 to 58. Okay, and I stopped at 58. However, this is the weird thing. The weird thing is, when the scope that was on that gun at the time, which is, it was a $1,200 scope, and I don't want to trash brands. I'm not trying to trash anything. I'm just trying to bring a point out. It had a big old S on it, but that gun there, and I noticed this with other people who had the same scope and had the same problem. And with that one there, okay, that scope it's not a cheap scope. It's a high dollar scope. Again, I can't understand why all these things were going crazy. Now this scope here, this March, I will talk about the March because I've shot this in 28 degrees up to 105, and I have never had a shift in it. Not the one that I can notice anyway. I may be wrong, but I know another fellow has the same exact 8 to 80 scope, and he said he does get a shift, but his is up at the high end when it gets hot. So making these click charts is extremely important. But the thing is, it's really weird, is with that scope with the S, when I shot, I was at a match the following year, the same year. We started off in the same cold temperatures in the 20, 29, 28 in that area. And I went around and I was using my cold chart the whole time. I used a laser thermometer when I sat down, figured out what the temperature was, looked on my chart. I clicked to the first target, checked my chart, added the clicks, and so on and so on. Cleared the first 9 lanes. Okay, so I know the chart worked. Now, the problem is, I figured out after all this back and forth with that in particular scope, at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, somebody throws a switch. I don't know, the pellet gods, whoever, but they throw a switch, and that scope goes exactly back to my 0. Okay, and everything else after that is on my normal clicks for my scope. So each scope that I've used now, I've used the one with the N. It was about a $1,100 scope. I've used the U, begins with a U, and hardly had any shift in the U. Of course, it's a lower price scope. I haven't used one, but the S and B, I understand, really had a lot of shift, and supposedly that company has corrected the problem they've had with it. Another thing you can do while you're out on the range, if you want to try, or you're on your match, and you want to try and keep it steady temperature to it, you can just throw one of these over it. A lot of people do that. I used to do it. I don't do it anymore. I just usually carry a towel, so I put the towel over it. That works better for me. So basically this film right now is to revisit an article I did outlining pretty much everything I just said for Hard Air magazine. And they printed it, they published it, and I got a couple people called me up, one from Florida, and he said, man, he said, that absolutely worked. He said, but I'm having a problem, this, that, and the other thing. So we sat down and talked about it, and I finally figured out to tell him it all depends on what you set your scope 0 at and start shooting at when you first set it up. So for me, I started mid-80s to 85, somewhere around that range when I set my scope up with the big S. Okay, so with that, when I went to cold under 62, I had my shift. But that S scope, I went all the way up to 102, 103, never had a shift from there, up to there. After that, it started to shift again, but a lot more minor than it did when it was in cold. So it really depends on the temperature that you do your initial 0 for that scope and rifle on. Now, and to double check myself, what I did is I would check with a thermometer, the laser thermometer. I would check my air tube. I'd check the receiver. I would check the barrel, and I would check the scope. And all those had differences to them. Okay, the one I figured out that I didn't have to worry about was the barrel, the air tube, the receiver, just the scope. Now, reason for it, I'm not a physicist. I don't claim to be any kind of physicist other than high school, but high school physics did teach me one thing. Okay, and that one thing is that metals all expand and contract at different temperatures. Okay, you know what it's like sometimes when you go to pick something up and it's been in the sun for a while, like aluminum or steel or whatever, and it'll burn your hand sometimes. Well, the same thing occurs with these scopes. Now, if you've never seen a scope on the inside, I found a cross section of one that I was impressed with. It was an actual photograph, and I don't remember the company or the scope, but 90% of that entire scope was all brass fixtures all the way through. The knob on the top, the knob coming down, there's a little brass, I call it a tack, that sits there. It's got a little pin in it, goes inside the bolt that goes in, usually stainless steel bolt, and that screws into what is called the erector tube. Now, most folks, this is not really what you're focusing through. What you're focusing through is a little tube that sits down on the inside of here. That is actually pushing down onto that tube. All right, let's use this here. So on the inside, this is the erector tube inside the bigger tube. Now you got a aluminum cap. You have an aluminum housing around the whole thing. Screwed into that aluminum housing is usually a stainless steel bolt that has a hole in the end, and on the end of that hole there's a little tack of brass, and that brass, that's to allow it to spin easy, and that brass pushes in or back or down, whichever way you're going with those. Okay, on the inside of that, on the opposite sides, are springs that are either stainless steel or usually in piano tension springs. So now we have the springs, you have the aluminum, you have the brass, and you have the stainless steel. They got 4 different things right there that are pushing on this the erector tube, and all of that is expanding at different temperatures. So what's doing it in there? Why it makes it go like that? I don't know which one's expanding faster or shrinking faster. To me, that's what I come up with. Okay, and if somebody can, give me a call, go to my website, just and explain it to me and tell me what the actual, I need a physicist to tell me exactly what's going on. Like I said, I'm not a physicist, just high school stuff, and that's it. So keeping all this in mind, there's also altitude. Now, altitude usually gets me 3 to 5 clicks difference, but usually you'll figure that out on the sighting range. So if you go and you get to the sighting range, for instance, at the Pyramid Cup, at their Grand Prix, I go up there, it was 50 degrees. So I was 5 off. So I know it, with it being 5 off, it's so close to coming up to that 62 degree mark. All I did was I just took my knob off, turned it around to give me 5 clicks additional, and put it back on. So that was an easy fix. Altitude is a different thing to deal with. This cold stuff and the temperature shift, or whatever, hot or cold temperature shifts in the scopes, is something that's been plaguing everybody that I know of in the field target community. This applies, I'm sure, for long-range shooters that are shooting. I know for a fact that these long-range 1,000-yarders that are out there shooting with the 308s and the 6.5 Creedmoors, and all the other powder burners have that to deal with too. And now I'm not even going to get into the rest of it, because not only are you dealing with that, you're also dealing with the heat mirage and a myriad of other things too. But for temperature shift on the scope, I think personally that this simple little thing right here, tuck it in your box when you're carrying it around, pull it out, hit your laser thermometer, cheap, buy them at Harbor Freight, cheap. Hit it, whatever the temperature says, it says it's between 40 to 55, and I just ranged this thing out to 40 yards. It's not actually 40, it's only 33. So I got to click up 7 clicks. That simple. Well, I hope this helps somebody, and if it doesn't, I try. And as I always tell people, I'll give you all the advice you want, or anything I can offer to you, but if it works for you, keep it. If it doesn't, throw it out. Don't worry about it. I won't be offended. So until next time, shoot safe, shoot straight, and have fun. Bye.